Well, it's me today because I just didn't want to bring in 3 or 4 speakers in a setting like this. It's just COVID-19 foolish. Or to put it meanly, my name is not Donald Trump. Or Mark Meadows. Or, common sense says, let's be safe. We've got a few moments before we get to 12:10, so I'm going to try and be patient and wait for late arrivals. Whilst we're waiting for late arrivals, any questions about the paper? About your paper? Yes, Matt. Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Could you respond? What are you supposed to do? Yes. I did say that. I swear I said that. And I emailed that too, right? Yeah. Send me an electronic version. This is, quote, abundance of caution stuff. And besides which, it'll be just as easy for me to read and assess your papers that way. And if I feel like I need to print something out, I can print it out anyway. Yes, ma'am. Well, I think what I want you to do is give your assessment of, say we're talking about healthcare. What are the key issues? The first paragraph should read, the following issues have been identified in the current presidential election campaigns as of substantial importance in this area. They are X, Y, and Z, right? And then you discuss each candidate's position on X, which might be COVID-19 and social distancing. And then on Y, which might be pre-existing conditions and protections or otherwise. Does that make sense? And then you want to draw a conclusion. And the conclusion should be as objective as you can make it. Don't say, I feel. You might say, the evidence on these issues is that wearing masks and social distancing reduces infection rates. And in New Zealand, for example, as a result of aggressive early approaches to that problem, there are virtually no cases that are occurring. You might want to say that because that's empirical evidence, right? Now, I'm not telling you what to say, but what I'm looking for is not candidate X is a moron. You might feel that. You might feel that Joe Biden is too old and too slow. You might feel that, but you do not write that. Imagine you're writing an informative op-ed for not the least intelligent member of your family, but a reasonably intelligent family member. Say your mom or your dad. Well, maybe he's not intelligent. I don't know. You raise your eyes. Oh, your eyes went way up there. But, I would say your fraternity brothers, but I'm not going to go there. The scope for being inappropriate is just enormous at that point. But does that help? Okay. So I'll be upset about incoherent grammar and horrible misspellings. I'm not going to get upset about whether or not you've got the economics exactly right. because there's a range of knowledge of economics in this class. And there are some of you that I might want to take after with a metaphorical baseball bat, if you show you don't know any economics. But there are others of you who it would be very unfair of me to do that. So that's not the issue here. What I want to do today is really do interactively with you what a panel would have done in terms of, here we are 6 days away from November the 3rd. Hopefully at the end of that, by midnight, November the 3rd, we'll actually know who's won and who's not won in most of the races that matter, including the presidential race. I was on the phone not long ago, literally 10 minutes ago, with a colleague who comes from a conservative background, and we both agree the worst outcome would be for this election to be thrown to the courts in some manner, the presidential election. It's not a civil discourse society at that point, and a lot of people are going to get even angrier than some of them seem to be today, on both the right and the left. My one politically inappropriate, well, hopefully my only politically inappropriate comment today is there are really bad guys on the right and gals. Let's be equal opportunity here. Similarly, on the far left, there are people who are not good people either, in terms of how they will react to an outcome they do not like. Ideally, the outcomes are so clear-cut that at least the uncertainty issues are taken off the table. That's a civil society view of the world. So here's the question. Where are the races today? And we might as well start with well, it's obvious that we should start with the presidential race. And what do we know? Well, what's the overall situation? That's pretty clear cut. If you throw away the not very reasonable polls, you get Biden with a 10 to 12 point lead. If you include the polls that historically have been biased one way or the other, the lead goes down to more like 9.5 points, averaged across all the polls. That's where nationally the race stands. But is that what counts, is the next question. And your answer would be no, right? Because of the electoral college process. Now, whether we like or dislike the electoral college process is not up for grabs in this class. We're going to take that as given. Yeah, I come from England, and it seems completely bizarre to me, but then parliamentary elections will seem completely bizarre to you all. The notion that in a district you win all the votes, but you actually don't win, is very strange to many people around the world. Just is. But we know that's not what counts. We know that what counts is the electoral map, right? So here are the battleground states: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Wisconsin, and for fun, Montana. And I forgot to put in South Carolina. Last time around, effectively, all the focus was on Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Virginia, which is not on the list now. Where's Virginia expected to go in the presidential race? Republican or Democrat? Democratic, yeah, because of population shifts and a whole bunch of other factors. There are surprising. I actually spent 4 years of my life living in Richmond, Virginia, and spent a fair amount of time going out to hike along the Appalachian Trail out in the western part of the state. So you drive out through the west, and it's obviously highly rural. exactly the sort of areas you'd expect lots of Trump voters to be located in today. You go east, and you go through the Sandhills, and you go east, and you go through the northern part of the Sandhills, and again, a lot of ruralness in Virginia. But what has happened, of course, is over the last 20 years, just south of Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, in Arlington, in Montgomery County, these are all counties that abut the District of Columbia or Maryland. That's where almost all of the population, or a huge proportion of the population growth, has occurred. And those are disproportionately people with PhDs and graduates. You almost can't walk down the street and not bump into 20 PhDs as you go to a Starbucks. That's just reflecting the changing nature of that state and where the population growth has been. So if on election night, initial returns from Virginia look like they're pro-Trump, they're coming in from small population areas like Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech is located. And Virginia Tech is a land-grant school, but around it is all of this agricultural, grazing land, forest land, and so on. It's Appalachia, really. Not on the list. So let's talk a little bit about where we are. Where are we in Arizona? Who's supposedly got the lead in Arizona? Biden by about 2 or 3 or 4, depending on which you believe. Historically, by the way, and if Henry Olsen were here, and it would have been great to have him back, wouldn't it? If Henry were here, he would be saying, late voters break for the winner. So the person who's ahead in the polls usually gets the late votes breaking for that individual. And that's not just in 2016, or a better way to put it is, late votes break for the winner or the person surging in the polls. So in 2016, those late decision makers, maybe that's you, let's pretend. In 2016, you were more likely to have voted for the Republican than the Democrat because the Republican was coming up in the polls. But in general, if there's not a surge from the guy behind, if anything, a surge towards the guy in front or the woman in front, then that's where the late deciders break. And there are some straws in the wind that would suggest that, by the way. So if you watched the second debate, right? If you watched the second debate, and then you went on to CNN, where they have that panel of, quote, undecideds. After the first debate, that panel of undecideds didn't move very much. And I think there were, out of the 12 or so people in that group, 3 who said, we've moved towards Trump. We've firmed up for the Republican. And there were only 2 who said we'd firmed up for the Democrat. But after the second debate, which was far less confrontational and far less problematic, it seems, for the president, among the similar set of voters, 8 shifted to the Democratic candidate and 0 to the Republican candidate. But that's a straw in the wind. That's not a careful scientific piece of information. It's a straw in the wind. But there are these straws in the wind. Did any of you see the poll numbers for Wisconsin that were reported today from a pretty respectable poll? He's up 17 points. Biden is up 17 points. He's gained 7 points in about a week. Where did those 7 points come from is a really interesting question. There's a question about, well, did they just get a weird group of a weird sample? But a 7-point move is outside the what's called margin of error. Basically, it's outside the two standard deviations from what you'd from the mean in the sample. So it's beyond the margin of error in terms of increase. That's a pretty stunning result. But of course, what makes Wisconsin important? What is driving, that's not quite the right word. What makes Wisconsin is important is that my daughter lives there, but that's neither here nor there. What makes Wisconsin important? Both of those things are true. But in the moment, why, if you turn on the news, are you going to hear the national news? Are you likely to hear about Wisconsin? I can't hear you. No, Wisconsin. There is a field hospital to deal with the overoccupation of intensive care units and hospital beds. That is where, in 2016, Donald Trump gave his critical speech. There's a field hospital in the middle of a stadium or something like that, a huge parking lot. Why is the field hospital there? Of course, Wisconsin is perhaps the state where COVID-19 is most spiking right now. So if I asked you, what is your number one issue in this presidential race that's most affecting your decision about voting? And I'm not asking you how to vote, but your decision about voting. Would the COVID pandemic and policy around it rank high or low? How many of you would say it's number one? Not too many, but some. If you were over 65, how many of you would say it's number one? Yeah. Yeah. Your granny is really worried about this, right? And if you look at the breakdown by age of what's the shift between 2016 and 2020 today, a big shift has occurred in the support given to the president by people 60, 65 and older. And which way has it gone, up or down? Down, yeah, very substantially. It is why Florida is an issue. What about Pennsylvania? Pretty much every analyst agrees that if Biden wins Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Melania Trump is going to have to hire a packing company to move them out of the White House. Of course, that's not how it happens, but that's the implication. So what about Pennsylvania? Who knows what the gap is right now? No. Yell it out. It is among all registered voters, it is 5%. Now, polls look at what? They look at registered voters and what else? Likely voters. So I'm going to put you in a bad light. You're a registered voter, but you drink heavily, and the odds that you will be sober enough to vote are very small. Sorry. You don't look like that's your problem at all. It might be yours, but not hers. All right, there we go. Among likely voters, Pennsylvania, 5-point lead among registered voters. Among likely voters, what's the number? Smaller or larger as a gap between the incumbent and the challenger? By how much is the challenger up? More or less, do you think? more. The gap there is 7. At least I was scouring the various serious journals, serious media. So likely voters, 7. What does that tell you about the ability of rallies that are narrowly focused in rural areas in Pennsylvania, not where most of the votes lie, and their likely impact on the race? Some, but modest, and likely already baked in, because both the president and the former vice president have been visiting those rural areas of Pennsylvania over the last week or two. So it just gives you a sense of where the race is in that state. Michigan, I think Michigan is around 5 among all votes. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I should have written this down, I suppose. Does that sound about right? Michigan, Biden is up by about 5 among all voters, and a little bit more, but not much, among registered voters, which explains why Michigan may be the president's best shot at a really late surge. His base appears to have eroded in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, especially among women who do not have more than a high school education. But that's not so true, not as true in Michigan, where the rural, mainly white-based vote has been looks as though it's going to be quite similar to the 2016 election. So why do you think in Michigan the vice president might be doing better than leaving aside issues? Well, they're tied to issues of how people perceived Hillary Clinton as opposed to Joe Biden. But what do you think might be driving Michigan, if it's not an erosion of that core, not very well educated base that has been firmly behind the president for the most part over the last 4 years? Go ahead, yeah. Well, yes, black turnout. Well, black turnout is an important part of the story. African-American turnout is an important part of the story. What do we know in Georgia, another of these toss-up states, where right now everyone says it looks, according to the polls, like a dead heat? What do we know about early voting in Georgia? Deathly hush. Well, it's very heavy. It's heavily Democratic, and that's true about almost every state where early voting is taking place, by the way. But African-American turnout in Georgia is expected to be particularly high. Now, there's another group. If I go through these states, what in God's earth is Iowa doing as a toss-up state? Other than the fact that the Republican senator didn't know the price of soybeans in an interview. Why is that in there? What about North Carolina? Well, North Carolina is a toss-up state anyway, by the way. It was won by Obama in 8 and 12. Biden is now a little bit ahead in North Carolina. I think 2 or 3 points, something like that. Well, North Carolina, the African-American turnout is important too. But I went and did my PhD at North Carolina State University. So that's where I did my PhD. My wife grew up in North Raleigh and actually was introduced to me by my PhD supervisor because he was supervising her master's degree. And he still doesn't believe she was stupid enough to marry me. He literally said that to me about a year ago. I still don't believe she married you. What on earth was she doing? Um, and he was right. What on earth was my wife, who's a really good woman, doing marrying me? Anyway, what is the area called the Research Triangle known for? That includes Chapel Hill, it includes North Carolina, it includes Raleigh, and it includes Durham. So when you think about that and you think about March Madness, what do you think about? Yeah, UNC, Duke, NC State. Between them, 10 or 12 national championships. When I was NC State, Jim Valvano was just about to win when I just left NC State, he was about to win his national championship. But what does that tell you about that area? What sort of people are disproportionately living in that Research Triangle area, which today has over 1 million people in it? Highly educated people, and where are they voting? Generally Democratic. What else do you have? How many? So Duke has about 10,000 students, 12,000 students. North Carolina State has 26,000 students, 30,000 students, somewhere in that, and NC State similar. There is the Research Triangle Park with IBM, Nortel, what was Nortel, the Research Triangle Institute. Lots of early and middle career, younger, under 40, scientists, economists, sociologists. Thousands and thousands of them. There are probably 20,000 PhDs working in the Research Triangle area, in the Research Triangle Park area, just alone. What about young people? What about people your age? What's happening as best we can tell in terms of what they are doing? Much higher turnout. Depending on the state, you're looking at double the turnout for people 18 to 30. You are twice as likely to vote. Well, let me put it differently. You're making it up double the share of votes already cast that you made up in 2016. And we have, by best estimates, more than half of the number of votes already cast that were cast in 2016 in early voting. So young people are not turning out like old people do. The reason why you all are, what's the right word I want? The reason why policy is generous to old people relative to young people is not just that we care about your grandmother or your great aunt, but they darn it vote, right? Well, in this election, it's not that people between the ages of 18 and 30 or 18 and 40 will vote proportionally more than the elderly, but they're voting much more intensively. And who are young people breaking for on average? Biden, right? So that explains, to some extent at least, North Carolina. It's an education state, even though we think of it as highly rural. Ohio, who's ahead in Ohio? Trump by 2. Yeah, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2, but just a little bit. What do we know about Ohio? Filled in its rural areas with religiously conservative people, right? Filled with people who used to work in industrial plants, and this is a Michigan issue too, and people who feel left behind by economic growth that we've as a country enjoyed since 1980. And the numbers don't lie. If you have a bachelor's degree plus, you have probably tripled your income prospects or close to tripled your income prospects in the last 35, 40 years. If you don't have more than a high school diploma, if you correctly adjust for changes in quality of goods and so on, you are better off, but you're only about 30 to 40% better off in terms of your ability to consume goods and services. Does that make sense to everybody? Some economists say, oh, your wages have completely stagnated in real terms. That's not quite right, but it does reflect a real issue. So suppose you're the high school kid who didn't go to college, got married and had 3 kids with this lady over here who also didn't go to college. Obviously I'm playing let's pretend. And this son of a gun went to college, and you knew him in high school, and you know he was a worthless little horror. You see his projection. He's now the aide to the ambassador for the US in France, right? And you always wanted to go to Paris. How are you going to feel about how the world is treating you? This is a real, genuine issue. It's the sort of issue that Sir Angus Deaton, when he came here 2 or 3 years ago to give a distinguished lecture, pointed to it as a cause for the deaths of despair that we've seen around the world, around our world. It's very understandable why people in rural areas whose incomes have not gone up at the rate that many of their peers have gone up are frustrated, want a different system, feel the system has been unfair, and also tend to care more so. Not everybody in a rural area supports the notion of the right to life, but many do. It's very understandable why they're at. And there are a lot of those people in Ohio whose parents and grandparents were adversely affected by lost jobs in the auto industry and the tire industry and so on. So that explains a little bit why Ohio may well vote for the president. If he doesn't get Ohio, just as if he doesn't get Florida, then it's impossible to see how the president could win enough states to come through. Who haven't I covered? Well, Iowa. Iowa is a puzzle. It's a mixture. Not everybody in Iowa grows corn and soybeans, although sometimes you might think they did. But agriculture is important in Iowa, as it is in Montana. It's also had a long history, though, of having working class people who tend to be union oriented in places like Des Moines. And if you work in a packing plant and you're eligible to vote, and your packing plant saw about 20% of the workforce come down with COVID-19, how are you going to feel? These are real issues here. God only knows about Texas. What's going on in Texas? The president appears in the latest polls to be up by 5 or thereabouts. That's roughly what we're seeing. But it's viewed as a relatively close race. And there it's partly population shift. Down ballot races are a bit of a concern for the Republican Party in Texas. Even John Cornyn, who's the number 2 or 3 Republican in the Senate, is concerned. Yes, sir. Latino men are shifting, depends where they are, but yes. Now, You've got to be careful. The Latino story is really interesting in Florida and in Texas. The Florida story is all about Cuba. So Hispanic people of Hispanic origin in Miami and other parts of Florida, a great many of those individuals are of Cuban heritage. Their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, when Castro took over Cuba and the Batista regime fell, moved to Florida. And so it's not people from Mexico, it's not so much people from, there are people from Mexico in Florida, but it's a much more Cuban focus. The history there is these tended to be middle-class, relatively well-off people who would be Eisenhower-type Republicans, to be honest. And in Houston, the story, I'm not quite sure what that story is, but there has been a movement, and I agree. But not everywhere, because I don't think that's true in El Paso, for example, or Brownsville. So it depends where you're at. Yes. I'm sorry, say it again. That, I think the history there makes that group far more amenable to the economic message that is coming from the Trump campaign. There also is another issue. It's almost taboo to talk about religion. But the bottom line is, if you're a conservative Catholic, you're going to weigh the issue on Roe v. Wade. I think much more importantly than if you're, just to be cruel about the churches that I tend to go to, you're a Presbyterian in Washington, D.C. And so that's not just the economic policies, though the economic policies are going to appeal to a group that tends to see themselves as small or large business people and entrepreneurs. And that's more of a traditional Republican message, but the right to life issue is in play, especially where you have a conservative Catholic population. And I'm emphasizing conservative because if you look throughout Europe at not very conservative Catholic groups, they have a very different perspective on the issue of right to life and so on. What about Montana? Where are we in Montana? He's up by 5, and that's pretty much viewed as, you know, I certainly wouldn't say that that's wrong. Just let's quickly take a look, if I can get there, at what Nate Silver's presidential predictions, which are the overall ones. Oh, it won't let me go there. Darn it. All right. Never mind. I looked at Nate Silver's projections this morning, and they were close to a probability of 90% for a Biden win. And you know, the discussion of where the race stands in those different states sort of might explain that. If you look at the Iowa electronic markets, and I was going to pull them up, but I haven't set this up efficiently to get there. If you look at the Iowa electronic markets, you have essentially a Democrat, the price, you're allocating $1 between the winner-take-all Democrat or Republican. You have to pay 87 cents or thereabouts, or that was yesterday or the day before, to buy a win for Biden, and 13 cents or thereabouts to buy a win for Trump. And so that's those are very consistent numbers. At which point everyone has to say, well, what was Nate Silver predicting in 2016? A 70% probability or 72% probability at the beginning of the day of the election for a Clinton win. But 72 is a lot different than 89 or 90. It's a big difference. And similarly with the Iowa election markets. Absolutely, that's perfectly correct. Absolutely right. Well, so let's talk about the Senate. So, where are the Senate races? And again, I'm sorry I can't just pull up quickly and easily the Nate Silver numbers. Nate Silver has a projection that it's about a 75% or 73% likelihood that the Senate will switch to Democrat. The Iowa markets really have a very similar number. It's like a 3-to-1 likelihood that the Democrats will take the House. So that's not quite the right way of putting it. It's 75-25, basically. Now, that means that there's much more uncertainty about whether or not the Senate will switch. So it's worth talking about individual races. So let's start with this one. And who isn't sick of adverts if you watch television? Or getting mail if especially the Republicans have got hold of your address, we would have a pile this high of whatever they want to call it, flyers. Yeah. Yeah. November the 5th in England is called Bonfire Night, where you have a bonfire and people in the neighborhood get around to celebrate Guy Fawkes not blowing up the Houses of Parliament. If I collected all of the flyers on my street, I could probably have a pretty good bonfire night experience. Well, the estimate is about $110 million has been spent in the state on this campaign alone between Bullock and Daines. There's one publicly available poll that was done out of the political science department and looks reasonably credible. It's been given a lot of play in the media, even in the Washington Post. Who's ahead, according to that poll that was taken about 10 days ago, completed about 10 days ago? Bullock by. So what does that really mean? We don't know. So what really matters about who's going to win? In this state, what is going to determine who wins and who loses? Turnout, absolutely. If we believe that number, Republican internal polls claim that Daines is ahead. Democrat internal polls, I'm not sure about. But ahead means by this much, either way. It looks like the Democrats are pouring more money into the last week of campaigning than the Republicans are pouring in. But, and that's usually an indicator of concern about your candidate not winning. If you move more money into the state, you're either saying we've got a chance of winning. You're basically saying we think we've got a chance of winning it. I'm not so sure. I don't know if any of you would know this. I'm not sure about how much is being offered. By the way, where's the House race in this state? We only have one, so it's easy. Who's ahead? I think it's within the margin. The numbers that I've seen say Rosendale has a slight lead. Well, you guys tell me. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's absurd. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they undersampled the Democrats, and they've probably undersampled independents as well. The in other words, it's really close. So I actually enjoy, I confess I enjoy watching Jeopardy. I hate the interruptions right now. So I'm going to have to suffer that for the next, God knows what, 5 days, 4 days, whatever it is. Um, what about South Carolina? That's Lindsey Graham and James Harrison. He has, why has Harrison, who he is African American, but he's also well connected in DC, why is Harrison able to collect so much money? Is it him or is it Lindsey Graham? Yeah. Even my, a lot of people in the middle right and to the left are not happy with Lindsey Graham, having viewed him as not stuck to his principles. Flip-flopping is a problem. What will now? Graham is up, what, 5? Last poll I saw, +3. Yeah. What will really drive whether or not he survives? I'm sorry? How many of you visited South Carolina in your lives? If you go into South Carolina, what do you see? An all-white community or a very racially diverse community? Exactly. 30% of the vote will be 30% of the eligible voting population, or a little bit more, is African American in that state. And what will drive whether or not that state re-elects Senator Graham will be African American turnout and turnout among uneducated. I hate saying uneducated because that's not fair to people. People who have had not very much education. If turnout among the rural white population, relatively low income, relatively limited education folks is substantial, it's what happens with those two groups. So South Carolina is definitely a place where we can understand why the president is only focusing on his base rather than on the middle, because it's a turnout issue there. What about Florida? Oh no, Florida's not over there. What about Georgia? Sorry. I'm sorry? They're toss-ups, absolutely. Well, yes and no. Both seats are up because Senator Perdue, who's a cousin of the Secretary of Agriculture, it's his 6 years time for election. Senator Loeffler was appointed to fill a vacated position because of loss of life. She is very unpopular, even among Republicans in the state. So that in her race, there are a whole bunch of, there's the Democrat and a whole bunch of other candidates from the Republican side who are competing for this seat. And Georgia has a rule that you have to get more than 50% of the vote to be elected. So the top two candidates run off. Right now, the Democrat is way ahead by 10 points over Loeffler, but not close to having 50%. It's what, about 28, 29, 30% is roughly where that candidate is. Purdue, it's sort of much more of a straight up and down, although there is, I think, a third party candidate. I can't remember if it's libertarian. Purdue has a very slight lead over his Democrat opposition. The interesting question is, will either of them get 50% of the vote? If not, there'll be a runoff, which will leave things there up in the air for both seats. In which case, God help you if you live in Georgia and watch television for about a month. What is interesting about North Carolina's race, where Senator Tillis is behind in the polls by about 4 or 5 points? His opponent, I think, is Cunningham. Is that right? What's interesting about that race? Well, what happened to Mr. Cunningham's propriety reputation about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago? Sorry? Yeah, he has been discovered to be having an affair with a woman who is not his wife. Yeah. What's happened to the polls since that scandal hit the papers? The right answer would be almost nothing. He remains ahead by 4 or 5 points. And this probably comes back in part to what I was talking about earlier. The nature of North Carolina, like the nature of Virginia, has changed over the last 40 years. Although it has elected Democratic senators before. In 2014, Senator Tillis won the seat from a Democrat, for example. What about Maine's? That's Senator Collins. She's down 4 or 5 points, and she might pull it out, but again, she's got problems because she's a moderate Republican. So turnout issues arise in terms of voting for her. Also, a lot of people in Maine are very angry with her over voting for Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. So there's a whole, and being overly supportive of Donald Trump rather than more of an independent. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's an attempt to save her seat. If she wins, I suspect she may flip into independent. You know, there are more ways to the Democrats controlling the Senate than getting 50 seats plus the presidency, which is what it takes. If she switched to being an independent, in which case she would almost certainly be given a pretty attractive committee assignment. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying, think about, to quote an advert that we've all endured, think about that. Yes, ma'am. It depends on the state, apparently. In general, you think of a rising tide lifting all boats, but there are state-specific variations. Well, Montana splits its vote. So Trump will probably win the state, but Bullock has what should I call it? 50-50 shot at winning the Senate. I mean, I'm just pointing out the numbers. It depends on the state. It depends on the occupant. Ernst has been surprisingly poorly viewed in Iowa relative to the expectations when she was elected. So she's not viewed as favorably today as she was in 2014 when she was first elected. At least that's what the evidence suggests if you look at the popularity numbers. Well, look, this is really the last meaningful class that we have. Next week, we have the election, and we can talk about what the hell has happened, although we may not know, right? But I have thoroughly enjoyed this class, even though we have not interacted. You have been impressive in the way that you have focused during every one of the presentations. And trust me, that's unusual, because there's usually one presentation through which 50% of the class falls asleep. And you just haven't done that, and I really appreciate that. And you've also been great about letting me know if for some reason you've not been able to go to class, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So I just want to thank you today for your performance in the class. And every one of the speakers has commented on the exceptional quality of the questions. Henry Olson started it off when he told me, I just didn't expect that a state school would have such intelligent students. That speaks to him too, right? You can tell he's a University of Chicago graduate, but what he was really saying was, the questions that came from you all were of the caliber or beyond the caliber of what he would expect from Harvard or Chicago or Yale. So thanks a lot. Have a fun week trying to avoid useless paper and horrible adverts.
Dr. Smith, I have a quick question about writing about macro.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
You back off a little bit because I don't have my mask on.
Okay.